Do you ever feel trapped in your own thoughts? Like you just can't get out and they just keep swirling around faster and faster and faster. No matter what you do, they won't stop. Well, you're in luck because today's episode, we're talking
You're
about your
trapped.
mind is your prison, how to break free. Yeah. Prison break, mind
Prison break.
style.
Mind
Yeah.
stuff.
This is the Existential Stoic podcast. I'm Randy. That's Danny. What's going on, Danny?
What's up, Randy?
Have you ever been trapped in your own thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, probably a million times. All the time, actually, I guess, right?
Yeah,
I am sort
essentially.
of a consequence of my own thoughts. When you suggested this topic, I was thinking about the allegory of the cave, Plato's allegory of the cave, where you have the
Hmm.
prisoners in the cave, like literally, they're
Hmm.
literally like tied down and chained down and all.
Hmm.
And their reality is the cave. And I always like that imagery because it's like it is kind of accurate, right? Like our reality is inside our heads. It's our thoughts, our interpretation of things, and we can get totally trapped in it, where led down the wrong path, think we're right, and not see because we can't see the world or the light outside of that cave, right? So we can't see the other side of things.
And it's crazy because like nowadays they've proven neuroplasticity, how we can change our mind
Oh
and
yeah.
change our thoughts. But it's like neurons that wire together fire or that fire together wire together. And so because we've been thinking these ways for so long, it makes it that much more difficult to think any different way.
It is crazy that that happens where our because of and I think different people probably experience this differently based on how their how rigid their beliefs are or their sense of truth, things like that. But it is interesting how we can get so stuck and refuse to see the world a different way just because those neurons keep being put together and we keep
Yeah.
thinking they should be this way. And it's interesting, because we can change our minds, we can change our thoughts. It's not impossible, but it does take work.
There was actually, I just listened to an episode of the Feeling Good podcast that was pretty much on this topic. It was an incredible episode. It was on microneurosurgery, which is essentially doing team CBT therapy, which because they talk
Oh, you
about
don't
how
mean
like
literal surgery. I was like, wow, they can do
not no,
micro. Oh.
not literal surgery.
For a
This is
second.
doing team
Yeah.
CBT therapy because what you're doing is you're basically finding whatever resistance is there and then changing like once you accept whatever's causing the resistance, then you're changing the thoughts. But it's crazy because they were talking about this one dude is I forget his name, but he's some neurologist somewhere. And anyways, I know. I'm being really, really specific about this. Anyways, there's two episodes that they have on microneurosurgery. The first one is episode 100. It's not that one. It's like somewhere in the 160s or something. That's the
Okay.
episode you want to listen to because essentially talk therapy, like psychotherapy, like it's been since Freud, actually reinforces the bad patterns in life because you just keep talking about the same thing over and over and over again and you don't change it. And so that, based on neurons that fire together, wire together, you're just making those pathways much stronger. But doing team CBT therapy, because what it does, first you test, then you build empathy, then you do the paradoxical agenda setting where you figure out what the resistance is, and then you do some methods to actually change whatever's causing the problem. So in those times, once you get rid of the resistance, then in those times you're able to really quickly change problems that have been there for months, years, forever. It's a completely like different way of doing it. So it's just, and it was a really good episode. They did a much better job than I just did, kind of describing it all.
Well, that's okay. Hey, that was a good explanation. No, I think that's a really cool idea. It makes sense. I'm always been grateful that I did study philosophy because I feel like it helps you with this because you're constantly literally you're constantly just reading stuff that has is giving you arguments for different ways of thinking about the world and interpreting the world and trying to understand them. So I think that for a lot of, well, maybe not everyone, but for a lot of philosophers, it can make it easier to change your thinking or see, imagine different interpretations or try on different, perspectives. Nietzsche always talked about that, he talked about it as experimentation and literally trying on different interpretations of reality to find your right one, what works for you. And
Mhm.
it's a really interesting idea, but it's you don't have to think about it as fixed. You can think of it as almost like a game. I'm gonna try out this way of looking at the world for now and see what the results are and see if it improves my situation, helps me overcome this obstacle, whatever it is. And if it works, great, adopt it. If it doesn't, right, you can try on a different one. But it's because all of this is contrived. It's all just how we how we perceive is just how we interpret the world, right? You can constantly manipulate it, which is really interesting. And I think it's a really powerful tool that we forget we have. I think too, for a lot of people, you know, it's so easy to get stuck in a way of doing things in this world because you go to college, you specialize, you get a job, you do this, right? It's so easy to just fall in that trap of like what everybody else is telling you is normal, and then you can't,
Mhm.
then you get tr stuck and unable to see outside of that.
And how often do you believe your thoughts are false?
Yeah, right? I mean, that's the
Like
other
most
thing.
people believe their thoughts are true.
All the
And
time,
that's
yeah.
yeah, it's rare when you believe your thoughts are false. But like I like what you're saying there with Nietzsche and everyone talking about questioning your thoughts because like one of the things that he does with the daily mood journaling is whenever you have like a situation in life that caused some bad feelings, you write down what your thoughts were at the time. And then
Yeah,
you see what type of cognitive distortions there are like something like, oh, this always happens to me.
yeah.
Well, that's all or nothing thinking. That's overgeneralization, a whole bunch of other different cognitive distortions. And then you can look at like, well, what are the benefits of believing that thought? Oh, well, I get to feel like a victim. That makes me feel pretty good. And there's a whole bunch of other
Well,
stuff.
yeah,
But
you
then
don't
you
have to
could
take
say like, what
responsibility for things. You don't have to, I mean, there's so many things. Yeah.
bingo. And then you could say, well, after you've identified the benefits of it and the cognitive distortions, you could say, like, well, what are some other possible thoughts? Like,
Yeah.
oh, yes, this happened again. And guess what? Statistically, it'll happen a lot, but it doesn't happen every time. And you just get to kind of examine other potential thoughts as opposed to just believing that the thought that just kind of like
Well,
poops out
that's,
of your brain is
yeah,
true.
that's the thing though, I think is the more you do this and like the more you try on different interpretations and try on different ways of looking at things, the more that rigidity falls away. Because you start to see that it's possible to look at this from so many different angles. And there's so many ways to go about this and to start practicing it. Even like what we were talking about before in the past episode about like journaling to understand a situation like interpersonal relationships and stuff. That's a way of, right, looking at it from another perspective, trying to interpret something differently. And just those little things can help you start to build this sort of ability that we have. Like, I think it's interesting because all the existentialists, like Camus mentions that too, like, they thought of our ability to interpret the world and see the world a certain way is like one of our most powerful attributes. Like it's really powerful if you think about it, and it can be changed at the drop of a hat based on, how we're feeling or based on, different ideas or different ways of looking at things. Like it's kind of amazing, and yet we don't exercise it that much.
Because it's hard work.
Yeah.
It's not easy. It's easy just to like be like
Well, it makes
almost
everything
like a
gray,
victim
right?
a
There's
victim of our
no,
thoughts.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's no black and white. There's no like right and wrong in that case. Everything becomes sort of up for grabs, and that makes it very hard too. Yeah, for
Yeah, but
people.
also to examine our thoughts is not easy. Like I
No.
I try and do these daily mood journal things kind of daily-ish, even though because it's hard. You have to sit down and you have to write down, you have to think, what was I thinking? You have to write
Yeah.
that down, and then you have to think about those thoughts, and then you have to write down stuff about your thoughts. And it's like it's a lot easier just to like binge watch Netflix.
Yeah. Oh, right. And just forget, right? And I think that's the other side of it is that, we're also tired and we're busy. And so this is like an extra step you're adding into your day that just is hard. Yeah. You just want to relax and watch TV or whatever, and it makes it. And I think this is the trouble too we find is that the world's so busy now. It's like, and it's so easy to just like turn off and distract yourself that it's hard to also find this time in a way to make yourself do this. You know? It's also interesting too, because like, I think we've talked about Nietzsche's the three metamorphoses from Zarathustra before, where the last metamorphosis of the spirit is a child, and like Buddhism talks about that too, where like the higher levels you go, like you get the childlike spirit sort of thing, and there's always this reference, and I always like that because it's like kids don't have these hangups that we do, like these biases, these fixed views of things, these fixed judgments, they kind of like they'll interpret an experience as it happens instead of like going into it being like this is going to suck because of this, this, and this, right? Or this is going to be terrible and
Or
whatever.
like they experience the experience. Like I find myself doing this all the time where I'm like trying to get done this experience, as if being done this thing will be any better than actually experiencing it and
Yeah.
doing it. And
We're rushing
kids
through,
just,
right?
yeah. Hmm.
Yeah. We're all trying to get to these goals and stuff, and instead of actually like being present, we're looking at if I accomplish this, what's the next thing? What's the next thing? How can this add, right? Or how can I get through this because I don't want to do it anyway, or whatever. And like, we never are actually present there to actually enjoy the time that we have and what we're doing. Yeah, it's hard being a person.
Yeah. So, why your mind is your prison and how to break free. So, how do you, yeah, I think we discussed why your mind is your prison.
Yeah,
How do
it's
you
because
break free?
I think you're trapped by your interpretation of reality, right? By your thinking of what's right and wrong, what's true, by these ideas that you have that do seem fixed, right? And I think that at least personally the best way is to start practicing, even if it's just pretending, trying on different ways of looking at things. Like do it as an experiment. Do it with journaling is also effective, but you can also do this without, like if you had an experience and you interpret it a certain way, ask yourself, well, how could I change that? What would I have to change that interpretation? How could I look at it differently? And it could be as simple as, like, I don't know. I think of examples now. That's hard. Ugh. Uh,
Well, while you're thinking about that, I'll say something on this. So, like, if your mind is your prison, then you have to recognize what's going on in your mind. And so,
that's
like you
also hard.
mentioned,
Yeah.
writing it down. And so, like writing down your thoughts, that's pretty because our thoughts are essentially what's going on in our mind. Like they're experience. Like Epictetus, or however you pronounce his name, he
Everything.
said, "Is yeah, it's not what happens to you in life. It's what you think, what you make of it." You know? And so that's essentially because, like, in life, there are all these experiences that are happening, but we're assigning values and judgments to all of them. And so starting to recognize those judgments, because, like, somebody could have something like somebody could get a door slammed in their face and they don't care. Somebody else could fly off the handle and go, like, you know, punch someone
Crazy.
else in the face. So
Yeah.
it's like it's not because a door slammed in their face. It's because how they interacted to that type of thing. And so starting to recognize the thoughts that are going on in your head and kind of like what the experience is, what the thoughts are, and kind of seeing, are there patterns going on? Do
Yeah.
I always fly off the handle?
Yeah. Am I always punching people when doors get shut real hard? You know? Yeah. And I thought I was using an example from my own life because that's easier. But like, I remember like when I was really down, like this was years ago. Um, everything felt hopeless, right? Like I felt like a failure, all this stuff. And what was the problem was I was missing a lot of stuff in my life that was good still, or that was really positive, even new things. And I know one of the biggest changes for me was when I stopped being so, so negative about it. And I started trying to be more positive. And one of the things I did was I looked around and just asked myself, like, well, what do I have that's good now? And I had like a really loving partner, I had good friends, I had time to change things, to actually change, like, to learn a new career, to do something different. And all those are really good positives. And I was just failing to see them because I was focused on this one interpretation of the world or one interpretation of my life that was making it seem like all the future is going to be hopeless, when in fact it wasn't. And I think that switch helped so much. And it took time. Don't get me wrong, it's not like it's instant, but it's a way to start working towards that, is to start looking at like, well, if I'm only seeing negative, what is there positive? How could I see some positive in this and start kind of flipping that switch a little bit?
Yeah, that's an awesome one. Discounting the positives. I do that all the freaking
Yeah,
time.
we
Like I
all do it
forget,
all the time.
like I forget so often because you get used to stuff. Like I worked so hard for so long to get to where I am right now, and because it's where I am right now, I've normalized it, and all the
Well,
good just disappears.
yeah, that's the easy, and I think it's the saddest thing because we do this with relationships all the time too, right? Like we're so fast at taking people for granted or taking a situation for granted because once it's normal, we're instantly looking for how can I improve it? How can I make this better? And why isn't that happening faster? Rather than looking at like, look at all this great stuff I have that I've worked for or that whatever, and I'm not even taking advantage of or even appreciating.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and hopelessness is like one of the world's oldest cons because in those times when you're hopeless, it has you believing that things will never change,
And that's
which
all everything does is change.
yeah, yeah, the definition of the universe is that things are going to change. but when you're hopeless, it feels like they never will. And unfortunately, people sometimes make drastic choices at those times.
Yeah.
And but actually, while we're talking about that, because I think that is important, because a lot of people do feel hopeless a lot, and it is something where if you have a friend who's feeling hopeless, it's really good to actually ask them some questions just to determine if they are suicidal, because then you could actually refer them to the proper resources, whether
Yeah.
it's, you know, having recommending that they go speak to a counselor, whether it's taking them to an emergency room, whether they're actively suicidal, calling the police just to stop it. But
You
there
do a
was actually
welfare
an
check.
episode.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So there was actually just an episode of the Feeling Good podcast where they went over some like questions that could be helpful. So, I mean, since we're in this thing, I
Yeah.
figured what better time than now. So, and they're like simple questions, but if you start to get yeses to any of these, it might give you an indication that something's going on. So, just the first question you could ask somebody is, do you sometimes feel hopeless or have thoughts of death? Do you sometimes wish you were dead? And so like it's just kind of like getting an idea, because if you have an idea, like I know
No,
there
I
was
think
one
there's a good
time,
point too, because a lot of people don't, even with their close friends, they don't ask questions about how they're feeling or their life. We tend to kind of treat that as private. And I think
Mhm.
most people are very receptive to those questions if you ask them because they want to be asked.
Yeah,
Even though they might not seem it, they want to be asked and they want other people to care, and you're showing that you care. So it's a really good thing to do.
yeah, like I know there was one time where I had these like crazy thoughts that were going on in my head, and it was like scary thoughts, and I talked with you about it, and just have being able to talk with a friend about it
Oh
was
yeah, it's
just
so
like
helpful.
it was so helpful, because I've like I told you about them, and you're like, yeah, that it's normal to have those type of thoughts. And I was like, wait, what? Hang on. I've been hiding this and thinking of this, and so it's just crazy. So, anyways, there's that. There's other questions that you could ask is, do you have fantasies of killing yourself, or do you just think you would be better off dead? That way you can determine if it's like passive or active type of suicide thing. Like a lot of times I'm down on life and I'm like, yeah, it would be easier to just be dead right now, but I don't,
Yeah, yeah.
like that's different from like actively planning or plotting or things like that. And then other questions, I won't go through all of them. You can just search for like Feeling Good Podcast Suicide, and I'm sure you'll find the episode about all the questions. But do you have urges for suicide? Do you think suicide is the only way out of your suffering? Do you have plans? What method would you use? And so like that just kind of starts like with like easy questions and then kind of gets more and more in depth so you
And
can
more
figure out
specific
how,
based on how it's going. Yeah, like
yeah.
yeah.
But it's like it's one of those things where it's super uncomfortable. Because like even just bringing it up in this episode, I felt a little bit of anxiety like bringing it up with you. But it's one of those things where it's like, would you rather feel uncomfortable right now and ask these questions to your friend, or would your friend commit suicide and then you feel really bad because you didn't ask these questions afterwards?
Yeah, and not
So
to mention again, I think everybody has these thoughts and talking about it. Like I think we hide this stuff so much rather than talking about it. And by taking the initiative to ask those questions, even just like simple ones, you're showing you care. And you're showing that it's not that big. I mean, it's not outrageous to have these thoughts. People do, people get in
yeah.
bad situations. It's fine. And I think it can be the world of difference for somebody. So yeah, it's a really good idea.
Yeah, like hopelessness and depression can make you feel like that's the only way out sometimes. And like philosophically, there was one of those books where it's like that's your last freedom is the thing to choose it. But on the same hand, it's like you can always commit suicide, so why now?
Yeah, it's final, right? That's a final
Yeah.
thing. Whereas you can, there's lots of other things you could try first and try to improve first and try to change. And especially your thinking, right? Before that. So that's always going to be a final decision. I think that is something to keep in mind. Like, there's
Yeah.
always, if you have time, if you have life left, there's always opportunities to change it.
Like I'm really inspired by the stories of Buckminster Fuller and William James. One was the guy who invented the geodesic dome. The other guy was like this father of psychology, but they both had times when they were like severely depressed, contemplating suicide in their life.
Yeah.
And both of them were like, you know what? I can always commit suicide, so why now? And they just figured, I'm just going to try as hard as I can for the next few months, the next year, whatever. And if nothing changes, then I'll do it then. And both of them came into like people who changed the world.
Yeah.
So It's
And I think
yeah.
all you need is positive. You just need some positive changes, and it makes you realize that everything can be better. And it just takes time and it's hard. Yeah, but it's
Mhm.
about changing your thinking, right? Not getting trapped in your brain.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
also there's some great books, Feeling Good, Feeling Great. Those are awesome books for anybody with anxiety or depression. And especially for people with anxiety, there's another book called When Panic Attacks. I mean, I've read every book this guy's come up with.
Yeah.
To me, he's like, I feel like I'm an evangelist, so I feel like
You are a
the
little. It's okay.
I have,
But it really
but
worked.
I
Who
feel like
cares?
this guy's the Michael Jordan when it comes to like psychology and understanding how the mind works. And like, I mean, he get all the time he gets called like a charlatan because there are these people who are depressed for like 20, 30 years, and in 2 hours he's able to completely relieve their
Well,
depression. And then years later they're asked about their depression. They're like, yeah, it's been gone since then. It like
I
came back for a little bit, but I just did the same thing and it's been gone forever. And I'm just like, this is next level stuff.
well, I find it interesting reading him too because so many of his ideas are just taken from philosophy, but they're put in a context that's one easier to understand.
Yeah.
And you don't have to look through a ton of different books, to find the
Mhm.
same things because they're all in one place. So I think it's really interesting, but it's a lot of ideas that have been there because we've all struggled with this forever. And I think that's the other thing
Yeah.
people forget is like it feels unique and like this is new and just you, but the reality is
Mhm.
humans have existed for a long time and they've always struggled with this stuff. So it's like we've
Yeah.
always been trying to figure out, and I think that's important to keep in mind too. Yeah,
Yeah. So there you have it. That is how to why your mind is your prison and how to break out of it. If you enjoyed that episode, we're always looking for new ideas for episodes. So if you have any, you can either post down in the YouTube video or you can email us. The email's down in the show notes. Until next time, though, we have hundreds of podcasts you can listen to if you're on a road trip and you need more. But this is the Existential Stoic
we
Podcast.
do.
I'm Randy. That's Danny. I'll see you later, Danny.
Later, Randy.